Some secrets are buried so deep that when they finally surface, they don't just change everything, they destroy it. Charles had lived 75 years believing he knew the woman he married, trusting in a love that had weathered public scandals, family tragedies, and the relentless scrutiny of an entire nation. But on a quiet Tuesday morning in November, while searching for old photo albums in the dusty corners of their private residence, his fingers would trace the outline of a door that wasn't supposed to exist. Behind that door lay a room that would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about loyalty, truth, and the woman who had stood by his side through decades of royal duty. What Charles discovered in Camilla's secret room wasn't just evidence of betrayal. It was proof that forgiveness, no matter how desperately he wanted to give it, would be impossible. Because some truths cut so deep that they sever not just trust, but the very foundation of who you thought you were. Charles set down his morning tea with trembling hands, the delicate china rattling against the saucer in a way that would have horrified his late mother. The November rain hammered against the windows of Clarence's house with an intensity that seemed to echo the storm brewing in his chest. At 75, he had learned to recognize the signs of his body betraying his emotions, but this morning felt different. This morning, the weight of 7 decades pressed against his shoulders like a lead blanket, and he couldn't shake the restlessness that had plagued him for weeks. Camilla had left early for a charity engagement in Yorkshire, her absence creating a strange hollow feeling in the grand house they shared. After 48 years of marriage to Diana, and then 17 more with Camilla, Charles had grown accustomed to the presence of others, the constant hum of activity that surrounded royal life. But today, the silence felt oppressive, almost accusatory. He wandered through the familiar corridors, past portraits of ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow his movements with disapproval. The weight of kingship, even at his advanced age, had never felt heavier. The recent health scares, the endless meetings about succession planning, the growing distance he felt from his sons, everything seemed to converge into a singular moment of profound loneliness. It was Margaret, their longtime housekeeper, who inadvertently set the day's events in motion. She had mentioned, almost in passing, that some of Camilla's old photo albums were stored somewhere in the East Wing storage rooms. Charles, desperate for any connection to happier times, had decided to retrieve them as a surprise for their upcoming anniversary. He wanted to create a memory book, something tangible to remind them both of the joy they had found together despite the turbulent path that had led them there. The East Wing of Clarence's house held the accumulated detritus of decades of royal life. Boxes of official papers, ceremonial uniforms that no longer fit, gifts from foreign dignitaries that had never found proper homes. All of it stacked in rooms that served as repositories for a life lived entirely in the public eye. Charles had rarely ventured into these spaces himself. Such tasks were usually delegated to staff members who understood the complex filing systems and storage protocols that governed royal households. But today, something drove him forward. Perhaps it was the need to feel useful, to engage in the simple, human task of sorting through memories. Or perhaps it was the growing sense that time was running short, that the opportunity to understand the full scope of his life was slipping away with each passing day. The first storage room yielded nothing of interest: boxes of Christmas decorations from years past, outdated furnishings from various residences, and stacks of official photographs that documented state visits and ceremonial occasions. Charles moved methodically through the space, his movements careful and deliberate despite the urgency he felt to find what he was looking for. It was in the second room that he first noticed something odd. The space felt smaller than it should have, given the dimensions of the building's architecture. Having spent years studying the layouts of various royal properties, Charles had developed an intuitive sense for spatial relationships. This room, he was certain, was missing approximately 6 feet of depth compared to what the building's floor plan should have indicated. At first, he dismissed the observation as a trick of perspective or perhaps the result of some long-forgotten renovation. But as he worked his way along the back wall, moving boxes and furniture to search for the photo albums, his hands encountered something unexpected. Hidden behind a tall bookshelf that seemed deliberately placed to obscure it, his fingers found the outline of what could only be a door. The discovery sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the November weather. Charles had lived in various royal residences all his life, and he thought he knew every room, every corridor, every hidden passage that existed within their walls. The history of these buildings was part of his heritage, passed down through generations of careful record-keeping and oral tradition. Yet here was a door that existed in no architectural plan he had ever seen, concealed behind furniture in a way that suggested intentional hiding rather than mere storage convenience. His first instinct was to call for Margaret or one of the other staff members who might have knowledge of the room's purpose. But something held him back, a combination of curiosity and a growing sense of unease that made him reluctant to involve others until he understood what he was dealing with. The door itself was unremarkable, painted the same cream color as the surrounding walls, and fitted with a simple brass handle that had clearly been used frequently despite its concealment. There was no lock that Charles could see, just a standard door handle that turned easily under his tentative pressure. Charles paused, his hand resting on the handle, suddenly, aware that he was about to cross a threshold that might change everything. In his long life, he had learned to recognize moments of significance, times when a single decision or action would irrevocably alter the course of events. This felt like one of those moments, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure. The rational part of his mind suggested benign explanations. Perhaps it was simply an old storage space that had been forgotten over the years. Maybe Camilla used it for Christmas gifts or other surprises, and the concealment was merely practical rather than secretive. Royal households were full of odd spaces and forgotten rooms, remnants of centuries of additions and modifications that had never been properly documented. But the emotional part of his mind, the part that had learned through painful experience to recognize when something was being hidden from him, whispered different possibilities. The careful placement of the bookshelf, the fact that the door was clearly in regular use despite its concealment, the simple reality that Camilla had never mentioned its existence. All of these details combined to create a picture that suggested something more significant than forgotten storage. Charles turned the handle and pushed the door open, stepping across the threshold into a space that would fundamentally change his understanding of the woman he had married and the life they had built together. The room beyond was not what he had expected. Instead of the dusty, neglected space he had imagined, Charles found himself in what appeared to be a carefully maintained office or study. The air was fresh, suggesting regular ventilation, and everything was meticulously organized in a way that spoke of frequent use and careful attention. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, their metal surfaces gleaming with recent cleaning. A desk sat in the center of the room, its surface clear except for a few manila folders stacked with precision. But it was the contents of those folders, and the implications of their very existence, that would prove to be the real discovery. Charles approached the desk slowly, his movements careful and quiet despite the fact that he was alone in the house. Already, without having examined a single document, he felt like an intruder in his own home. The sensation was deeply unsettling, a reminder of other times in his life when he had discovered that the people closest to him had been operating in worlds he knew nothing about. The first folder contained what appeared to be financial documents, bank statements, investment records, and correspondence with financial advisors whose names Charles didn't recognize. At first glance, they seemed routine, the kind of paperwork that might be expected in anyone's personal files. But as he looked more closely, patterns began to emerge that suggested something more complex. The accounts were all in Camilla's name alone, which wasn't necessarily unusual given their arrangement of separate personal finances. But the amounts involved were staggering, far beyond what should have been possible given her known sources of income and the financial arrangements they had made when they married. The investment portfolio alone represented millions of pounds, money that seemed to have no clear source or explanation. More troubling were the regular transfers and payments that appeared to be ongoing for years. Large sums moved on a monthly basis to accounts Charles didn't recognize, payments that were labeled only with cryptic codes and reference numbers. The pattern suggested not just hidden wealth, but active financial relationships that had been carefully concealed from his knowledge. Charles set the financial documents aside and reached for the second folder, his hands now noticeably shaking. If the money was disturbing, what he found next was devastating. The folder contained correspondence, letters, emails printed out, and what appeared to be copies of text messages spanning several years. The first letter, dated just 3 months after his wedding to Camilla, was from Andrew Parker Bowles, her first husband. But this was not the polite, formal correspondence that Charles might have expected between former spouses who had maintained an amicable relationship. The tone was intimate, familiar, and spoke of ongoing emotional and physical connection that should have ended decades earlier. Charles read the letter 3 times before the full implications sank in. Andrew was not just writing as a friend or co-parent discussing their children. He was writing as a lover, referencing shared memories and future plans that painted a picture of a relationship that had never truly ended, merely gone underground. The subsequent correspondence painted an even more disturbing picture. There were arrangements for secret meetings, discussions of shared financial investments, and references to decisions about their public appearances that suggested careful coordination to maintain the illusion of separation while preserving their private connection. But it was a series of emails from the past year that proved most devastating. In these messages, Camilla and Andrew discussed Charles himself with a casual cruelty that left him breathless. They referred to him as the old man and my royal meal ticket, discussing his health problems and personal struggles with the detached amusement of observers watching a particularly entertaining performance. One email, sent just weeks before Charles's most recent cancer treatment, contained Camilla's response to Andrew's question about Charles's prognosis. "The doctors are optimistic. More's the pity," she had written. "I was rather hoping this might be the graceful exit we've been waiting for. The timing would actually be quite convenient." Charles set the papers down and walked to the window, his legs unsteady beneath him. The November rain continued its relentless assault on the glass, creating rivulets that distorted his view of the garden beyond. For a moment, he allowed himself the luxury of hoping that what he had read was some kind of elaborate fiction, perhaps material for a novel or play that Camilla was working on. But the dates, the specific references to private moments and conversations, and the mundane details that filled the margins of these communications all pointed to their authenticity. The third folder contained photographs, and these provided the final, irrefutable proof of what the documents had suggested. Pictures of Camilla and Andrew together at various locations and events over the years, often during times when she had told Charles she was elsewhere. A cottage in the Cotswolds that Charles had never seen, where the couple appeared completely at home and comfortable. Images of them with other couples, clearly part of a social circle that existed entirely outside Charles's knowledge. But it was the final photograph that broke something fundamental inside him. Taken just 6 months earlier, during a weekend when Camilla had told him she was visiting her sister in Scotland, it showed her and Andrew in what was clearly a bedroom, their bodies intertwined in a way that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The casual intimacy of the scene, the comfortable familiarity of their positioning, spoke of a connection that had been maintained and nurtured throughout the entirety of Charles's marriage to Camilla. Charles sank into the chair behind the desk, the photographs scattered across its surface like evidence in a criminal trial. In a way, he supposed, that was exactly what they were. The evidence of a crime not against the state, but against his heart, his trust, and his fundamental understanding of the life he thought he had been living. The room around him suddenly felt oppressive, its careful organization now appearing sinister rather than merely private. This was not just a hidden space where Camilla kept personal papers. It was the headquarters of a double life, a place where she had maintained and coordinated a relationship that made a mockery of everything Charles thought they had built together. He tried to remember signs that he might have missed, moments when Camilla's explanations for her absences or activities had seemed strained or incomplete. But the horrifying truth was that he couldn't identify any clear warning signals. She had been masterful in her deception, maintaining two completely separate lives with an efficiency that spoke of years of practice and careful planning. The practical implications began to dawn on him slowly. The financial arrangements would need to be unraveled, their shared assets protected, and the legal ramifications of the deception addressed. But beyond the practical concerns lay something more devastating: the complete destruction of his faith in his own judgment and his ability to understand the people closest to him. This was not the first time Charles had been betrayed by someone he loved, but somehow it felt worse than the others. With Diana, there had at least been warning signs, moments of conflict and tension that had suggested underlying problems in their relationship. But with Camilla, he had felt secure, confident that they had found peace and understanding in their later years. The discovery that this security had been an illusion, carefully maintained through systematic deception, left him feeling fundamentally unmoored. If he could be so completely wrong about Camilla, about the nature of their relationship and her feelings toward him, then what else in his life was built on false assumptions? Charles gathered the documents and photographs, his movements mechanical and precise. He would need time to process what he had discovered, to decide how to proceed in a way that protected not just his own interests, but the stability of the institutions he represented. But even as he planned his next steps, he knew with absolute certainty that something essential had been broken beyond repair. The forgiveness that he had always prided himself on offering, the capacity for understanding and reconciliation that had carried him through previous betrayals, felt entirely beyond his reach. Some discoveries cut too deep, revealed deceptions too fundamental to allow for the kind of healing that might lead to forgiveness. As he prepared to leave the hidden room, Charles took one last look around the space where his marriage had effectively ended. The careful organization, the meticulous record-keeping, the evidence of years of planning and coordination, all of it testified to a level of deliberate deception that transformed the betrayal from a personal failing into something approaching calculated cruelty. He turned off the lights and closed the door behind him, but he knew there would be no hiding from what he had discovered. The contents of that room had irrevocably changed everything, and there would be no going back to the comfortable illusions that had sustained him for so many years. Charles spent the remainder of that November day in his private study, the documents from Camilla's hidden room spread across his desk like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture he had never wanted to see. The afternoon light filtering through the windows gradually faded to evening darkness, but he remained motionless in his chair, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. The practical side of his nature, shaped by decades of royal duty and crisis management, insisted on organization and analysis. He had arranged the papers chronologically, creating a timeline that mapped the duration and evolution of Camilla's deception. The earliest documents dated back nearly 15 years, suggesting that the relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles had never truly ended, merely transformed into something more covert and systematic. What emerged from this chronological arrangement was a pattern of calculated manipulation that went far beyond simple romantic betrayal. The financial records revealed a complex network of shared investments and hidden assets that suggested not just emotional infidelity, but financial conspiracy designed to protect and expand wealth that rightfully should have been disclosed during their marriage. More disturbing were the communications that revealed discussions about Charles's own future, conversations between Camilla and Andrew that treated his health, his longevity, and his personal struggles as variables in their long-term planning. They had discussed scenarios for his death with the dispassionate calculation of business partners reviewing contingency plans for a corporate acquisition. Charles found himself returning repeatedly to a particular email exchange from 18 months earlier, during a period when he had been experiencing significant health concerns that had required extensive medical consultation. While he had been grappling with mortality and the fear of leaving unfinished business, Camilla had been corresponding with Andrew about how his potential death might be managed to their advantage. "The succession planning has him quite worried," Camilla had written. "He's been talking about wanting to ensure I'm financially secure, which is rather touching given how secure I already am. I've encouraged his generous impulses, naturally. Andrew, darling, we may finally be approaching the endgame we've planned for so long." The clinical coldness of the language was what hurt most. Charles had interpreted her support during his health crisis as evidence of love and devotion, while she had apparently viewed it as an opportunity for manipulation and personal gain. The revelation transformed their most intimate moments into performance pieces, making him question whether any emotion she had ever expressed toward him had been genuine. Margaret knocked softly on his study door just after 7 in the evening, asking whether he wanted dinner served. Charles declined, claiming a lack of appetite that was entirely truthful. The thought of food, of normal domestic routines, felt absurd in light of what he had discovered. How could he engage in the ordinary business of eating and sleeping when the foundation of his life had crumbled beneath him? After Margaret left, Charles found himself studying the photographs more closely. They spanned several years and multiple locations, providing a visual record of the relationship that Camilla and Andrew had maintained throughout his marriage. The images were not the furtive snapshots of people conducting a brief affair, but the comfortable documentation of an ongoing partnership. There were pictures of them at social gatherings with other couples, clearly part of a circle of friends who were aware of and accepting of their relationship. Images of them in what appeared to be a privately owned cottage, surrounded by personal possessions that suggested regular occupancy. Most painful were the photographs that showed them in moments of casual intimacy, reading newspapers together over breakfast, walking hand in hand through country lanes, sharing private jokes in restaurant settings. The cottage particularly intrigued and disturbed him. From the photographs, it appeared to be a substantial property, well-maintained and expensively furnished. Charles had no knowledge of Camilla owning such a property, and the financial records suggested it might be jointly owned with Andrew through one of their complex investment arrangements. The idea that they had maintained what amounted to a shared home throughout his marriage felt like a violation that went beyond personal betrayal. Charles attempted to call his private secretary, but then thought better of it. The implications of what he had discovered would require careful consideration of legal, financial, and public relations consequences that were too complex to address in his current emotional state. The royal family's history was littered with marital scandals that had been handled poorly, creating lasting damage to the institution's reputation and effectiveness. He also found himself reluctant to share his discovery with anyone, even trusted advisors, until he had fully processed its implications. There was something deeply humiliating about the systematic nature of the deception, the way it revealed his own blindness and gullibility. The man who was supposed to possess the wisdom and judgment necessary to lead a nation had been thoroughly deceived by the woman who shared his bed. As the evening wore on, Charles began to consider the broader ramifications of his discovery. The revelation of Camilla's ongoing relationship with her first husband would inevitably become public knowledge if he chose to act on what he had learned. The scandal would dominate headlines for months, possibly years, providing endless fodder for tabloid speculation and undermining the dignity of the monarchy at a time when it could least afford such distraction. But the alternative, continuing to live with the knowledge of her betrayal while maintaining the public fiction of their marriage, seemed equally impossible. The thought of sharing meals with her, attending public events together, and maintaining the intimate routines of their relationship while knowing the truth about her feelings and activities felt like a form of psychological torture. Charles found himself thinking about his sons and how this revelation would affect them. William and Harry had both struggled with the complexities of royal marriage and the challenges of maintaining authentic relationships under public scrutiny. His own marital failure would inevitably be seen as part of a pattern, reinforcing narratives about the impossibility of finding genuine love and companionship within the constraints of royal duty. The financial implications were equally complex. The hidden assets that Camilla had accumulated with Andrew's help would need to be legally separated from the legitimate wealth she had acquired through their marriage. But the process of untangling these financial relationships would require disclosure of information that could prove embarrassing or damaging to the royal family's reputation. More troubling was the possibility that other aspects of their life together had been similarly falsified. If Camilla was capable of maintaining such an elaborate deception about her primary emotional and physical relationship, what other elements of their shared existence might be built on lies? Charles found himself questioning every conversation, every shared decision, every moment of apparent intimacy from their years together. He attempted to identify moments when the truth might have been visible, times when her deception might have been apparent to a more perceptive observer. But the horrifying reality was that she had been extraordinarily skilled at maintaining the fiction. Her responses to his affection had seemed genuine, her engagement with royal duties appeared authentic, and her integration into his family and social circle had been seamless. The professionalism of her deception was almost more hurtful than the betrayal itself. This was not the work of someone who had fallen unexpectedly into an affair, but the systematic maintenance of a double life by someone who had approached their marriage as a form of elaborate performance art. Charles tried to remember their wedding day, the emotions he had felt, and the hopes he had harbored for their future together. The ceremony had taken place after years of public scrutiny and scandal, representing what he had believed to be a chance for authentic happiness after decades of duty and compromise. The discovery that even this relationship had been built on deception felt like the final destruction of his capacity for trust and hope. The evening newspapers had been delivered to his study, and Charles found himself staring at the headlines without really seeing them. The ordinary concerns of politics and current events seemed impossibly distant from the personal catastrophe he was experiencing. How could he be expected to care about economic policies or international relations when his own life had been revealed to be a carefully constructed lie? He considered calling one of his sons, but realized he had no idea how to explain what he had discovered. The conversation would require him to acknowledge not just Camilla's betrayal, but his own complete failure to recognize it despite years of opportunity. The admission of such blindness felt almost as humiliating as the betrayal itself. Charles found himself returning to the question of why Camilla had married him at all if her true emotional and physical allegiance remained with Andrew Parker Bowles. The financial incentives were obvious. Marriage to the heir to the throne provided access to wealth, status, and security that would have been impossible to achieve through any other means. But the personal cost of maintaining such an elaborate deception for so many years suggested motivations that went beyond simple greed. Perhaps it was revenge for the years of public humiliation she had endured during his first marriage, when her relationship with him had made her a target for media criticism and public disapproval. The systematic nature of her deception might represent a form of calculated payback, a way of punishing him for the damage that their earlier relationship had caused to her reputation and personal life. Or perhaps it was simply opportunism, the recognition that marriage to him provided a platform for a lifestyle and status that she could never have achieved otherwise, while the hidden relationship with Andrew allowed her to maintain the emotional and physical connections that actually mattered to her. The combination would give her all the benefits of royal marriage while preserving the relationships that provided genuine satisfaction. Whatever her motivations, the skill and persistence required to maintain such a deception suggested a capacity for calculation and manipulation that Charles found genuinely frightening. If she was capable of this level of systematic dishonesty about something so fundamental, what other deceptions might she be maintaining? How much of their shared life was real? And how much was carefully constructed fiction designed to serve her purposes? The grandfather clock in his study chimed 11 times, and Charles realized he had been sitting in the same position for nearly 6 hours. His body ached from the lack of movement, but the physical discomfort seemed insignificant compared to the emotional devastation he was experiencing. He felt fundamentally changed by what he had discovered, as if the person he had been that morning no longer existed. Charles carefully returned the documents and photographs to their folders, his movements deliberate and precise. He would need to secure these materials, perhaps in the royal family's private safe, until he could determine how to proceed. The evidence they contained was too damaging to leave unprotected, but too devastating to act upon without careful consideration of all the consequences. As he prepared to leave his study, Charles caught sight of his reflection in the mirror that hung beside the door. The man looking back at him appeared older than he had that morning, as if the day's revelations had accelerated the aging process in some fundamental way. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, his posture more stooped, his expression marked by a weariness that went far beyond physical fatigue. He realized that he would need to see Camilla the following day when she returned from Yorkshire, would need to sit across from her at breakfast, and maintain normal conversation while processing what he had learned about her true feelings and activities. The prospect of such performance felt overwhelming, but the alternative, immediate confrontation, carried risks that he was not yet prepared to handle. Charles turned off the lights in his study and made his way to his bedroom, the folders tucked securely under his arm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult decisions, and the beginning of a process that would fundamentally transform the remainder of his life. But tonight, he simply needed to find a way to sleep despite the knowledge that everything he had believed about love, loyalty, and marriage had been revealed as carefully constructed fiction. The rain continued its assault on the windows of Clarence's house, and Charles found its rhythm oddly comforting. The weather, at least, was exactly what it appeared to be: cold, wet, and relentless, without hidden agendas or secret motivations. In a world where his most intimate relationship had been revealed as performance art, there was something reassuring about the honest brutality of a November storm. Charles woke the next morning with the disorienting sensation of emerging from a nightmare, only to realize that the nightmare was his new reality. The events of the previous day came rushing back with cruel clarity as consciousness returned, bringing with it a physical pain that settled deep in his chest like a stone he would never be able to dislodge. Camilla was due to return from Yorkshire that afternoon, and Charles found himself dreading her arrival with an intensity that surprised him. For months, he had looked forward to her returns from various engagements, enjoying the way her presence filled the quiet spaces of their shared life. Now the thought of seeing her face, of listening to her voice, of maintaining normal conversation while knowing what he knew, felt like an impossible challenge. Margaret brought his morning tea with her usual efficiency, commenting on the severity of the previous night's storm and inquiring about his plans for the day. Charles managed to respond appropriately, but he could see concern in her expression as she noted his obvious fatigue and distraction. The housekeeper had worked for the royal family for over 20 years, and she possessed the keen observational skills that came from decades of anticipating the needs and moods of her employers. After Margaret left, Charles sat at his breakfast table, staring at newspaper headlines that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the attention he could pay them. The ordinary concerns of politics and current events felt completely disconnected from the personal crisis that dominated his thoughts. How could he be expected to care about economic policies when his entire understanding of his personal life had been revealed as fiction? The morning appointments on his schedule included a meeting with his private secretary about upcoming charitable engagements and a briefing on environmental legislation that he had been following closely. Under normal circumstances, these would have been the kind of productive, meaningful activities that gave structure and purpose to his days. Now they felt like elaborate charades that he would somehow need to perform while his inner world collapsed around him. Charles found himself studying his reflection in the bathroom mirror, looking for signs of the transformation he felt certain must be visible to anyone who looked closely. Surely the magnitude of what he had discovered would leave marks that others could see, evidence of the fundamental shift in his understanding of himself and his life. But the face looking back at him appeared disappointingly normal, showing only the usual signs of age and the slight redness around his eyes that could be attributed to poor sleep. The realization that his devastating discovery might not be immediately apparent to others brought with it a new form of anxiety. If his own emotional transformation was invisible, how many other people around him might be experiencing similar deceptions while maintaining perfectly normal facades? How much of the life he observed and participated in might be carefully constructed performance designed to hide entirely different realities? Margaret knocked again, this time to inform him that his private secretary had arrived for their scheduled meeting. Charles knew he would need to find a way to function normally, at least for the immediate future, until he could determine how to proceed with what he had learned. The alternative, immediate action that would inevitably become public, carried consequences that were too complex to address without careful planning. The meeting with his secretary proceeded with surprising normalcy. Charles found that he could respond appropriately to questions about his schedule, offer opinions on proposed charitable events, and engage in the routine business of royal duty while his mind remained largely occupied with his personal crisis. The discovery was both reassuring and disturbing. Reassuring because it suggested he could maintain his public responsibilities despite his private devastation, but disturbing because it revealed his own capacity for the kind of performance that he now knew Camilla had been maintaining for years. During a break between appointments, Charles retreated to his study and carefully reviewed the documents he had secured the previous evening. In the harsh light of morning, they seemed if anything more damning than they had the night before. The financial records revealed patterns of deception that went back to the earliest years of their marriage, while the correspondence painted a picture of emotional betrayal that was both systematic and casual. One particular series of text messages, dating from just 3 months earlier, captured the cruel indifference with which Camilla and Andrew discussed Charles's personal struggles. During a period when he had been dealing with significant anxiety about his role as king and the future of the monarchy, Camilla had shared his private fears and concerns with Andrew, who had responded with mocking commentary that treated Charles's genuine worries as entertainment. "He's been having nightmares again about the coronation," Camilla had written. "Last night, he woke up convinced that the crown was going to fall off his head during the ceremony. I had to spend 20 minutes reassuring him that the crown fits properly and that he won't embarrass the family." Andrew's response had been swift and cutting. "Perhaps we should loosen it a bit and give the poor dear something real to worry about." At least then, his anxiety would be based on actual reality rather than imagined inadequacy. The casual cruelty of their exchange was devastating enough, but the revelation that his most private vulnerabilities had been shared for their mutual amusement added layers of humiliation to the betrayal. Charles had trusted Camilla with fears and insecurities that he had shared with no one else, believing that their marriage created a safe space for emotional honesty. The discovery that these confidences had been transmitted to her lover for their entertainment felt like a violation that went far beyond simple adultery. As the morning progressed, Charles found himself becoming increasingly anxious about Camilla's return. The ordinary routines of their life together, shared meals, evening conversations, the casual physical intimacy of long marriage, now seemed like elaborate performances that would require acting skills he wasn't certain he possessed. How could he kiss her hello, ask about her trip, or share observations about his day while knowing what he knew about her true feelings and activities? Charles attempted to prepare for her arrival by rehearsing normal conversation, practicing responses to the questions she would inevitably ask about his day and his activities during her absence. But every potential topic felt loaded with dangerous implications. If she asked about his time in the storage rooms, should he lie to protect his discovery? If she inquired about his mood, how could he explain his obvious distraction without revealing its cause? The practical implications of his discovery were becoming clearer as the day progressed. The financial arrangements would require legal consultation, both to protect his own assets and to understand the full scope of the hidden wealth that Camilla had accumulated. The correspondence suggested possible legal violations related to financial disclosure requirements for royal family members. The photographs provided evidence that could be used in divorce proceedings, but would also inevitably become public and create a scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation for generations. Charles found himself thinking about his late mother and the challenges she had faced during the marital difficulties of his siblings. The Queen had always emphasized the importance of maintaining public dignity regardless of private struggles, but she had also possessed the strength and determination necessary to weather scandals that might have destroyed lesser institutions. Charles wondered whether he possessed similar resilience, or whether this betrayal would prove to be the crisis that finally broke his capacity for public service. The grandfather clock in his study chimed 2 in the afternoon, and Charles realized that Camilla would be arriving within the hour. He returned the documents to the secure location where he had stored them, double-checking that there was no visible evidence of his discovery. The irony of concealing his knowledge of her concealment was not lost on him, but it seemed like the only viable option until he could determine how to proceed. Margaret knocked to inform him that lunch was ready, but Charles declined, claiming a lack of appetite that was entirely truthful. The thought of food remained repugnant, as if his body was rejecting the normalcy of basic physical needs while his emotional world remained in chaos. He asked Margaret to prepare tea service for 3 o'clock, knowing that Camilla would expect their usual routine of afternoon tea together after her return from engagements. Charles spent the remaining time before Camilla's arrival attempting to compose his thoughts and prepare for what would essentially be a performance. He would need to ask appropriate questions about her trip, share observations about his own activities, and maintain the emotional warmth that had characterized their interactions for years. The challenge was not just avoiding revelation of what he had discovered, but actively maintaining the fiction of their relationship while processing his own emotional devastation. The sound of a car in the driveway announced Camilla's arrival, and Charles felt his heart rate accelerate in a way that reminded him of the anxiety attacks he had experienced during his first marriage. The physiological response to deception and emotional conflict was apparently similar regardless of age or experience, a reminder that some aspects of human nature remained consistent throughout life. Charles positioned himself in the drawing room where they typically met after her returns from engagements. He chose his usual chair and arranged his expression into what he hoped would pass for normal welcome and interest. The sound of the front door opening, followed by Camilla's familiar voice greeting the staff, created a surreal contrast with the knowledge of her betrayal that dominated his thoughts. When Camilla entered the drawing room, Charles was struck by how completely normal she appeared. There was no visible sign of guilt or anxiety, no evidence that she was maintaining any kind of emotional conflict about her double life. Her smile seemed genuine, her movement toward him natural and affectionate. For a moment, Charles found himself wondering whether he had somehow misunderstood what he had discovered, whether there might be some innocent explanation for what had appeared to be damning evidence. But as Camilla kissed him hello and began describing her activities in Yorkshire, Charles found himself studying her face with new attention. The ease of her deception, the complete absence of any visible strain from maintaining such an elaborate fiction, suggested a capacity for manipulation that he found genuinely frightening. This was not someone struggling with guilt or conflict about her betrayal. This was someone who had mastered the art of living multiple lives simultaneously. "You look tired, darling," Camilla observed, settling into her usual chair across from him. "I hope you haven't been working too hard while I've been away. You know how you get when you spend too much time alone with your papers and official business." The casual intimacy of her concern felt like mockery in light of what Charles now knew about her true feelings. The text messages he had read the previous day had included numerous references to his health and work habits, but always in the context of calculating how these factors might affect their long-term plans. Her expression of concern was probably genuine, but not for the reasons he had always assumed. "Just the usual meetings and correspondence," Charles replied, grateful that his voice sounded steadier than he felt. Nothing too demanding. How was the charity event? I saw some coverage in this morning's papers that suggested a good turnout. As Camilla launched into a detailed description of the event and the people she had met, Charles found himself analyzing her words and expressions for signs of deception. The skill she displayed in maintaining normal conversation while concealing such fundamental aspects of her life was remarkable and terrifying. If she could deceive him so completely about her primary emotional and physical relationship, what other aspects of their shared existence might be equally fictional? The afternoon tea arrived, and they fell into their usual routine of shared service and comfortable conversation. But, for Charles, every element of their interaction now felt loaded with hidden meaning. When Camilla expressed affection, was she performing for his benefit while her true feelings remained elsewhere? When she showed interest in his activities and concerns, was she gathering information to share with Andrew for their mutual entertainment? The most disturbing aspect of the afternoon was how natural their interaction felt despite his devastating knowledge. Charles found himself responding to her warmth and attention in ways that felt automatic and genuine, even while his rational mind understood the falseness of their situation. The realization suggested that human beings were capable of maintaining emotional connections even when the foundation of those connections had been revealed as fiction. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Charles began to understand that his greatest challenge would not be confronting Camilla about what he had discovered, but determining whether he could continue living with the knowledge while maintaining their public and private relationship. The alternative, immediate action that would inevitably become public, carried consequences for the monarchy and the family that went far beyond his personal pain. Charles found himself trapped between impossible choices, each carrying costs that felt unbearable in different ways. He could expose her betrayal and face the public scandal that would inevitably follow, or he could continue living with the knowledge while maintaining the fiction that had sustained them for years. Neither option offered the possibility of genuine resolution or healing. The evening routine of dinner and conversation proceeded with the same surreal normalcy that had characterized the afternoon. Camilla shared observations about people she had met and events she had attended, while Charles offered appropriate responses and questions that maintained their usual pattern of interaction. But beneath the surface of normal domestic life, he felt the foundations of his world continuing to crumble with each passing moment. When they retired for the evening, Charles lay awake listening to Camilla's steady breathing beside him, wondering how many nights she had shared this same bed while her heart and mind remained focused on another man. The physical intimacy that had once provided comfort and connection now felt like another form of performance, another element of the elaborate fiction that had defined their marriage. Charles stared at the ceiling of their bedroom, processing the reality that his life had been fundamentally changed by his discovery, while Camilla slept peacefully beside him, apparently untroubled by the deception she maintained. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight he simply had to find a way to coexist with knowledge that made forgiveness feel impossible and yet made immediate action seem equally unbearable. The following weeks passed in a blur of carefully maintained normalcy that Charles found increasingly exhausting. Each morning brought the challenge of resuming his performance as a devoted husband, while each evening ended with the private torment of processing what he had learned about Camilla's true loyalties and activities. The emotional toll of maintaining such a fundamental deception began to manifest in physical ways that even his well-trained staff began to notice. Margaret, ever observant, had begun making subtle inquiries about his health and suggesting that perhaps he should consider scheduling a checkup with his physician. Charles's appetite had diminished significantly, and his sleep was restless and frequently interrupted by dreams that mixed memories of happier times with the harsh reality of his discovery. The irony was not lost on him that he was now experiencing the physical symptoms of deception, while Camilla continued to display no visible signs of stress or conflict about her double life. 3 weeks after his discovery, Charles made the decision to conduct his own investigation into the scope of Camilla's betrayal. The initial documents he had found suggested a pattern of deception that might extend beyond her relationship with Andrew Parker Bowles to encompass other aspects of their shared life. If she was capable of maintaining such elaborate lies about her primary emotional and physical relationship, what other deceptions might she be concealing? Charles began by carefully reviewing their financial arrangements and the access she had to various accounts and properties. What he discovered was a pattern of small but consistent irregularities that suggested systematic financial manipulation. Credit card statements showed charges for locations and activities that didn't correspond to the explanation she had provided for her absences. Investment accounts revealed transactions that had been made without his knowledge or consent, despite their agreement about joint financial decision-making. More troubling were the property records he was able to access through his legal team. The cottage that had appeared in the photographs with Andrew was indeed jointly owned by Camilla and her first husband, purchased through a complex trust arrangement that had effectively hidden their shared ownership from Charles's knowledge. The property had been maintained and improved over the years using funds that appeared to have been diverted from their legitimate joint accounts. But it was Charles's investigation into Camilla's communications that revealed the true scope of her betrayal. With the help of his security team, he was able to access records that showed a pattern of contacts and relationships that painted a picture of a social and personal life that existed almost entirely outside his knowledge. The hidden phone records revealed regular communication not just with Andrew, but with a network of friends and associates who were apparently aware of and supportive of her double life. The most devastating discovery was a series of recorded telephone conversations that his security team had been able to retrieve from telecommunications records. The calls, spanning several months, captured Camilla and Andrew discussing not just their relationship, but their long-term plans for the future, plans that treated Charles's eventual death as a welcome development that would finally allow them to live openly together. "I've been patient for so long," Camilla could be heard saying in one particularly painful conversation. Playing the devoted wife, attending endless charity events, pretending to care about his environmental causes and his architectural opinions. "But, frankly, darling, I'm getting too old for this level of performance. When this finally ends, I want to spend whatever time I have left being honest about what actually matters to me." Andrew's response revealed the calculated nature of their entire arrangement. The financial settlements are all in place, and the public sympathy factor will work in our favor when the time comes. The devoted widow who stood by her husband through his health challenges and royal duties. It's quite a compelling narrative. We'll be able to live very comfortably on the proceeds, and without the constant strain of maintaining the fiction. Charles listened to these recordings multiple times, each hearing revealing new layers of cynical manipulation that he had failed to recognize during their years of marriage. The conversations made clear that Camilla's entire relationship with him had been approached as a business arrangement designed to secure financial and social benefits while preserving her true emotional connections elsewhere. But perhaps the most painful revelation was how thoroughly she had discussed his personal vulnerabilities and private struggles with Andrew and their circle of friends. Charles heard his own words quoted back in context that made them sound foolish or pathetic, his concerns about his role as king treated as material for entertainment, and his health problems analyzed primarily in terms of their potential impact on Camilla's inheritance and future security. One conversation, recorded just days after a particularly intimate discussion he had had with Camilla about his fears regarding his legacy and his effectiveness as a monarch, captured her sharing his confidences with Andrew in mocking detail. "He spent an hour last night worrying about whether historians will remember him as an effective king or just as the man who destroyed the monarchy through his personal scandals," she reported. "I had to bite my tongue to keep from pointing out that his personal scandals are nothing compared to what's coming if we ever decide to tell the truth about this arrangement." The recordings revealed that their social circle had been aware of the deception for years and had actively participated in maintaining it. Friends who had welcomed Charles warmly at social gatherings had apparently been laughing behind his back at his obliviousness to what everyone else knew about his wife's true relationships. The humiliation of this revelation was almost worse than the betrayal itself, transforming social memories that had seemed pleasant into evidence of his own gullibility and their collective contempt. Charles also discovered that Camilla had been providing Andrew with detailed information about royal family business, including sensitive matters related to succession planning, family financial arrangements, and private discussions about other family members. The breach of trust extended far beyond their personal relationship to encompass violations of royal confidentiality that could have serious implications for family security and institutional integrity. Most disturbing was evidence that Camilla had been documenting their private life in ways that suggested preparation for eventual publication or disclosure. She had maintained detailed journals of their conversations, particularly those in which Charles had expressed doubts or concerns about family members or royal duties. The journals appeared to be written with an audience in mind, presenting events and conversations in ways that emphasized his weaknesses and her patience in dealing with them. The discovery of these journals forced Charles to confront the possibility that everything he had shared with Camilla, every private moment, every expression of vulnerability, every intimate conversation, had been recorded and preserved for purposes that served her interests rather than their relationship. The violation felt complete and absolute, transforming their entire marriage into a form of surveillance operation disguised as emotional intimacy. Charles found himself becoming paranoid about their continued interactions, wondering whether his responses to the knowledge of her betrayal were also being documented for future use. The realization that he could no longer trust anything about their relationship created a level of psychological stress that began to affect his public duties and his interactions with other family members. William called to inquire about his father's obvious distraction during recent public appearances, expressing concern about Charles's health and suggesting that he might want to consider reducing his official commitments temporarily. The conversation forced Charles to confront the reality that his personal crisis was beginning to affect his professional effectiveness, creating the potential for broader consequences that could damage the institution he had sworn to protect. Charles found himself tempted to confide in William about what he had discovered, but the implications of involving his son in such a devastating family scandal felt overwhelming. William had his own family to protect and his own royal duties to fulfill. The burden of knowledge about Camilla's betrayal felt too toxic to share, even with family members who might be able to provide support and guidance. The isolation created by his discovery was becoming unbearable. Charles felt completely alone with knowledge that was too devastating to share, but too significant to ignore. Every day brought new challenges in maintaining the fiction of his marriage while processing the reality of its fundamental falseness. The performance required constant vigilance and emotional control that left him exhausted and increasingly resentful. Margaret, during one of their routine morning consultations, finally asked directly whether something was troubling him. Her concern was genuine, and Charles found himself desperately tempted to share at least part of what he had discovered. But the implications of involving staff members in royal family secrets felt inappropriate and potentially dangerous. Instead, he deflected her concerns with vague references to work pressures and seasonal fatigue. The Christmas season was approaching, bringing with it the prospect of extended time with Camilla during family gatherings and traditional celebrations. The idea of maintaining his performance during the heightened intimacy and emotional intensity of holiday traditions felt almost impossible. How could he participate in gift exchanges, family dinners, and ceremonial events while knowing what he knew about her true feelings and relationships? Charles began to understand that his situation was unsustainable in the long term. The psychological stress of maintaining such a fundamental deception was affecting his health, his work performance, and his relationships with other family members. The choice between confronting Camilla about what he had discovered and continuing to live with the knowledge was becoming less theoretical and more urgently practical. But even as he recognized the need for eventual action, Charles remained paralyzed by the potential consequences of any decisive step. Exposure of Camilla's betrayal would create a scandal that could damage the monarchy for generations. Divorce proceedings would inevitably become public and provide endless material for media speculation and criticism. The revelation that the king had been so thoroughly deceived by his own wife would raise questions about his judgment that could undermine his effectiveness as a leader. The trapped feeling intensified as Charles realized that every option available to him carried unacceptable costs. Continuing the charade meant accepting a life built on fundamental dishonesty, while ending it meant risking damage to institutions and relationships that extended far beyond his personal situation. The knowledge that Camilla appeared to feel no similar conflict about their situation, that she continued to sleep peacefully beside him each night while maintaining her elaborate deceptions, only added to his sense of isolation and despair. Charles found himself studying the photographs from Camilla's hidden room again, looking for clues about when and how their relationship had become so completely false. The images spanned years, suggesting that there had never been a period when her commitment to him had been genuine and exclusive. The realization that their entire marriage had been built on deception meant that there was no earlier, happier time to return to, no foundation of authentic connection that might be restored through forgiveness and reconciliation. The impossibility of forgiveness was becoming clearer with each passing day. Charles had always prided himself on his capacity to understand and forgive human failings, to find ways to move beyond conflict and betrayal in service of larger relationships and institutions. But this betrayal was too systematic, too calculated, and too complete to allow for the kind of healing that might lead to genuine reconciliation. As December arrived and the demands of royal Christmas traditions began to intensify, Charles knew that he was approaching a crisis point that would require decisive action. The performance he had been maintaining was becoming unsustainable, and the knowledge he possessed was too devastating to continue carrying alone. Something would have to change, and soon, regardless of the consequences that might follow. The confrontation came not through Charles's careful planning, but through an accident of timing that stripped away any possibility of further delay. On a cold December morning, just 3 days before the royal family's traditional Christmas gathering at Sandringham, Charles returned early from a meeting that had been unexpectedly shortened due to a colleague's illness. He entered Clarence's house through his private entrance, intending to spend the extra time reviewing correspondence, only to find Camilla in the drawing room speaking quietly, but intensely, on her mobile phone. She had not heard his return, and her voice carried clearly through the open doorway as she spoke with obvious intimacy to someone Charles immediately recognized as Andrew Parker Bowles. What he heard in those unguarded moments finally shattered his capacity for continued performance and patient endurance. "Darling, I can't bear much more of this," Camilla was saying, her voice filled with frustration and weariness. "He's been even more clingy than usual lately, wanting to spend extra time together, talking about making new memories before we get too old. It's absolutely suffocating. I find myself counting the hours until I can get away and breathe normally again." Andrew's response was audible through the phone. "Perhaps the Christmas holidays will provide some relief. Large family gatherings always give you plenty of excuses for separate activities." "Yes, but then there's New Year's to get through, and he's been making noises about wanting to take a private holiday together somewhere romantic. The idea of being trapped alone with him for days makes me want to scream. Sometimes I wonder if we should just accelerate our timeline rather than waiting for natural causes to solve our problem." Charles stood frozen in the hallway, finally, hearing the casual cruelty and contempt that had been hidden behind years of performed affection. The woman he had loved, supported, and trusted was discussing their marriage as a burden to be endured and him as an obstacle to be eliminated. The conversation confirmed his worst fears about her motivations while revealing depths of deception that exceeded even what he had discovered in her hidden room. When Camilla finally ended her call and emerged from the drawing room, she found Charles standing in the hallway with an expression that made further pretense impossible. For the first time since their marriage began, he saw genuine fear cross her face as she realized that her carefully maintained facade had finally collapsed. "Charles, I didn't hear you come in," she began, her voice artificially bright as she attempted to return to her usual performance. "How was your meeting? You're back earlier than expected." But something in his expression stopped her mid-sentence. Charles looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, no affection, and no possibility of continued deception. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an authority that made further lies impossible. "I know about Andrew," he said simply. "I know about the cottage, the financial arrangements, the hidden accounts, and the years of deception. I know about your plans for the future and your feelings about our marriage. I know everything, Camilla." The transformation in her demeanor was immediate and complete. The mask of loving wife disappeared, replaced by the calculating expression of someone whose primary concern was damage control rather than remorse or explanation. She studied his face carefully, apparently assessing how much he actually knew and what options remained available to her. "I see," she said finally, her voice now stripped of any pretense of warmth or affection. "How long have you known?" "Weeks," Charles replied. "I found your hidden room while you were in Yorkshire. I've had time to review everything, the documents, the photographs, the financial records, the recordings. I understand the full scope of what you've been doing and why." Camilla moved to the sofa and sat down heavily, no longer bothering to maintain her usual graceful posture. For a moment, she appeared almost relieved that the performance was finally over, as if the burden of constant deception had been heavier than Charles had realized. "So what happens now?" she asked, her tone businesslike rather than apologetic. "Are you planning to make this public immediately, or do you want to discuss terms for a more discreet arrangement?" The casualness of her response, the complete absence of shame or regret, struck Charles as more devastating than anything he had discovered in her hidden files. Even now, faced with the collapse of her deception, she was approaching the situation as a negotiation rather than a reckoning with the damage she had caused. Terms, Charles repeated, struggling to process her apparent view of their confrontation as a business discussion. Camilla, you've been living a lie for our entire marriage. You've been planning for my death as if it were a welcome business opportunity. You've shared our most private moments with your lover for entertainment. And you're asking me about terms? Camilla's expression hardened, revealing a coldness that Charles had never seen before but now realized must have been there all along, hidden behind her carefully crafted performance of devotion. Oh, please, she said, her voice sharp with contempt. Don't play the wounded husband now. You knew exactly what kind of arrangement this was when we married. I was never going to be your great love. That ship sailed with Diana, didn't it? You wanted a wife who could fulfill royal duties without causing scandals. And I wanted security and status after years of being treated as your guilty secret. We both got what we wanted. The casual dismissal of their relationship as a business arrangement struck Charles like a physical blow. Even knowing what he knew about her deception, he had retained some hope that their connection had contained elements of genuine affection and care. The revelation that she had never viewed their marriage as anything more than mutual exploitation felt like the final destruction of his capacity for trust. I loved you, he said quietly, the past tense feeling strange and painful in his mouth. Whatever brought us together initially, I came to love you genuinely. I trusted you with everything, my fears, my doubts, my hopes for the future. I believed we had built something real together. Camilla's laugh was harsh and entirely without humor. Love? Charles, you loved the idea of me, the fantasy of finding peace and happiness in your later years after the disasters of your youth. You loved having someone who made you feel wise and appreciated, someone who didn't challenge your opinions or demand too much emotional sophistication. You never actually knew me well enough to love the real person. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Camilla systematically dismantling every assumption Charles had made about their relationship and his understanding of her character. She spoke of their marriage as a performance she had grown tired of maintaining, of him as a burden she had accepted in exchange for social and financial benefits, and of their future as something she endured rather than anticipated. But it was her discussion of the other people in their lives that proved most devastating. She revealed that many of their mutual friends had been aware of her ongoing relationship with Andrew, treating Charles as a figure of pity or amusement rather than the respected partner he had believed himself to be. Staff members had been instructed to facilitate her secret communications and activities, making him the only person in his own household who was unaware of the deception being practiced against him. Margaret knows? Charles asked, thinking of the housekeeper who had served his family for decades. Margaret has been helping to coordinate my schedule for years, Camilla replied matter-of-factly. She's the one who makes sure Andrew's calls come through on my private line when you're in meetings. She arranges for flowers to be delivered from him on significant dates. She's been wonderfully discreet and efficient about the whole arrangement. The revelation that even his most trusted staff members had been participating in the deception felt like a fundamental violation of every relationship Charles had believed he could count on. The isolation was complete. He had been surrounded by people who were actively working to maintain lies about the most important relationship in his life. As their confrontation continued, Charles began to understand that Camilla had no intention of ending her relationship with Andrew or changing her behavior in any meaningful way. She spoke of the possibility of more discreet arrangements, of better operational security for their deception, but never of genuine remorse or the possibility of rebuilding their marriage on a foundation of honesty. The question now, she said as their conversation drew toward its conclusion, is what you're prepared to do about what you know. Making this public would hurt you as much as it hurts me, perhaps more. The scandal would dominate the rest of your reign and overshadow whatever legacy you hope to leave. Are you really prepared to destroy your own reputation to punish me? Charles realized that she was probably right about the public implications. The revelation of her systematic deception would create exactly the kind of royal scandal that dominated headlines for years and undermined public confidence in the monarchy as an institution. The personal cost to him would be enormous, but the institutional damage might be even greater. But he also understood that continuing their marriage while knowing what he now knew would be impossible. The psychological torture of maintaining intimate daily contact with someone who felt such contempt for him, who had systematically exploited his trust and affection, who continued to plan for his death as a welcome development. It was beyond his emotional capacity to endure. "I can't forgive this, Camilla," he said finally. "Not the affair, not the financial deception, and certainly not the years of calculated manipulation. But, more than that, I can't continue living with someone who feels such complete contempt for me while pretending otherwise. The performance you're asking me to maintain would destroy whatever sanity and dignity I have left." Camilla studied him for a long moment, apparently recognizing that her usual methods of persuasion and manipulation would be ineffective in this situation. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of genuine concern for the first time in their conversation, though Charles suspected it was motivated more by self-interest than empathy. "So what do you propose we do? Whatever arrangements we make will need to account for the impact on the family and the institution. This isn't just about us anymore." Charles had been thinking about this question for weeks, and he had reached conclusions that surprised even him. The discovery of Camilla's betrayal had clarified his priorities in ways that years of royal duty and compromise had never quite achieved. "I'm going to announce my abdication," he said quietly. "I'm going to step down as king and allow William to assume the throne. I'll cite health concerns and the desire to ensure a smooth transition while I'm still alive to assist in the process. You can choose whether to maintain the fiction of our marriage or pursue a discreet divorce. Either way, I'll be withdrawing from public life entirely." The proposal clearly shocked Camilla, who had apparently expected negotiations about continued arrangements rather than Charles's complete withdrawal from the situation that had enabled her deception. "You can't be serious," she said. "You've waited your entire life to be king. You're going to give up the throne because of marital problems." "I'm giving up the throne because I no longer trust my own judgment about the people closest to me," Charles replied. "If I could be so completely wrong about you, about our marriage, about the fundamental dynamics of my own household, then I lack the wisdom and perceptiveness necessary to lead effectively. The institution deserves better than a king who can be so easily manipulated and deceived." The conversation ended with no resolution except the mutual understanding that their marriage, in any meaningful sense, was over. The practical arrangements, legal, financial, and public relations, would require weeks of careful planning and negotiation. But the emotional reality was immediate and final. Forgiveness was impossible, trust had been completely destroyed, and any future relationship between them would be built on entirely different foundations. Charles spent the following days in a strange state of emotional exhaustion mixed with profound relief. The burden of maintaining his performance was finally over, replaced by the different but more manageable challenges of planning his withdrawal from public life and the dissolution of his marriage. For the first time in weeks, he slept soundly, no longer tormented by the need to maintain deceptions that had become psychologically unbearable. The announcement of his abdication, when it came 3 months later, cited health concerns and the desire to ensure a peaceful transition of power. The public received the news with a mixture of surprise and respect, viewing his decision as evidence of wisdom and consideration for the institution rather than personal failure. The details of his marital difficulties remained private, handled through discreet legal channels that protected both parties from public scandal. Charles never learned whether Camilla felt any genuine remorse for the years of deception she had maintained. By the time their practical affairs were settled and their public separation announced, their personal contact had been reduced to formal communications handled through intermediaries. The woman he had loved had revealed herself to be someone he had never really known, and the possibility of understanding or reconciliation had disappeared along with his capacity for forgiveness. In his retirement, Charles found a peace that had eluded him during his years of royal duty and marital compromise. The discovery of Camilla's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed him from illusions that had limited his capacity for genuine happiness and authentic relationships. Some truths, he learned, were too fundamental to forgive, but they were also too important to ignore. The price of knowledge was sometimes the destruction of everything you thought you knew about your life, but the alternative, continuing to live within carefully maintained lies, was ultimately more destructive to the human spirit than even the most painful truth.